there, Lord. I thank you for helping me get home safe and as quick as I did. Thank you for helping me get through this day. Thank you for bringing us all together this evening, Lord. I ask for help to get through this study. My mind is tired, but I know it'll wake up once we start getting through into the incredible message that we have. Please help me to have a clarity of mind and to be able to speak things clearly so people can understand, and help me and guide me through this message so it can be given with strength and power so that people can understand your word, Lord. We thank you for this evening. We thank you for the rain that's finally come so we don't have to worry about power shutoffs anymore, Lord. We thank you so much for that. And we ask that you continue to be with us throughout the rest of the week. In Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen. Okay. So I haven't gotten a chance to go back through this since the time that I transcribed it, which was a bit ago. But we're just gonna read through the transcript, but I'm gonna have some comments on the side that I'm gonna go over. So this is from Admin Australia. After the Bible conference in Germany, you guys know they had a few initial videos. I don't know what location it was at, but it was also in Australia, where she was going over explaining in depth the lines of the split that had just happened. So you guys have gone over those already in this Bible study, and she shows how us and FFA, how that split happened, how she shows it from the lines that it was prophetic the way it happened. This is where she starts to leave that topic and to go back into the Midnight Cry message and review it and bring it together and add some more details into it. So the title of this sermon is He Sent Prophets, but They Would Not Give Ear. So basically, we are familiar with light upon line and reform lines. This is the work of God in bringing people out of darkness or out of captivity and preparing them to do a work. Right, so that's what our line upon message has. You have 1989 where we come out of darkness and the message opens and light comes in. So let's go over some examples of that and see what they teach us about our reform line. First, I'm going to go down here. We have the line of the 144,000. You have 5 waymarks based on the description that Ellen White gives us, right? Mostly, which it mainly addresses these 3 and also this 4th one, which is within these 2 major waymarks. This is what this rate. How? Why won't it? Okay, here we go. So those are the ones that Ellen White talks about. You, as it like in the future to happen, right? She's making an application in the future when she talks about them. And she talks about things getting progressively worse until these things happen. These 2 waymarks, from what I can understand of what we've been doing, are derived from us making an application that we take from her time period, the time period of the Millerites, because they were supposed to have the actual time of the end. What we did is we took an application of it. It was supposed to, everything, all history, this planet, everything was supposed to end in their time, but that didn't happen. So what we do now is we have to make an application of the time of the end. It's basically the time of the end part 2, or try number 2, if you can think of it that way. And we have to have an empowerment to the message, like they did. And so we have that here. It's not the fulfillment that we thought from her writings, but it's still like a third of woe and a very important waymark that we need to have that gives strength and validity to this message and helps it be propagated forward. So these three she directly speaks about that can happen in the future, but these two we made application of from what I can see. And so if you think about it, what she saw and the way she wrote everything that she wrote was 1798 is the time of the end. You have that Islam event in August 11th, 1840, and then things are going to get progressively worse and worse, and then one day the Sunday law is going to happen, and then the close of probation is going to happen, and then the second advent. So for her and the Millerites, they were always in her mind somewhere like right here. Everything just seemed to be getting worse and worse until this would happen, the Sunday law. So almost it seems like all her writings are taken that are warning people of what's coming are taken from this vantage point, this perspective right here. I was thinking about this today as I was trying to write some side notes for her, but it's just an interesting thing to try to get into her mindset and figure out what exactly she was trying to say and what she was trying to do. So we have that. You have our 5 waymarks. The loud cries within these two, so we're not looking at that as one of our 5 waymarks. You have, so these 5 waymarks are based on literal events that happen and either directly talked about biology-wide or an application of historical events that have happened. So that's how we set up this line. There's something she talked about, or they're an application of something that she talked about that happened in their time. That's how we built this reform line. Now, we take this reform line, we have this structure, we know the characteristics of the time of the end and what that looks like, from darkness to light, a message unsealed, a messenger chosen. All these things happen here. A people passed by. These are all characteristics of this waymark. You have Islam event, a national crisis. That's this waymark. You have a former rain start here. You have a plowing. Well, no. Let's not go there. So this is an Islam event and it's a national crisis. This is literal, right? Sunday law. You have laws that are forcing people against their conscience happening or affect something to the effect of that. This is this waymark. You have close of probation, where the time period that people get to decide ends and people are either chosen on one side or the other. They've made their decision. And then you have the second advent where everything is, ends. So these, and Christ comes. So these have very specific characteristics. And we have this clear line. And what we do from here forward is we take different models from parables or stories or anything else you can find in the Bible or in the spirit of prophecy. And we can make models out of that are typology models, not progressive models. And we can stack them on top of this and apply them to this and get even more information about what happens at these waymarks and in between these waymarks. So, for example, we have the agricultural model. So we can see that this line has 5 waymarks and 4 dispensations in between. And when you look at the agricultural model, when you go through slowly and you line it up, there are 4 processes, technically 5, but the time periods of the processes are: you have a plowing. Seed time is a singular event, and but plowing is a longer time period. And then you have former rain, which is the time period. You have latter rain, which is a time period, and you have harvest, which is a time period. So we can see that those will fit this structure here, so we can make a direct application. And so now we have more information and more characteristics of a work that's happening here and a work that's happening here and one that whatever's happening here and here. And so, that's how we're building more and more information on these lines. And that's where it gets really complicated, because we go back and forth between models and different things. But this is the 144,000 is our line, okay? And everything we do is going to be based off of this and in relation to this line. Now, let's see here. In 2014, we came to a greater understanding of this reform line. We found through the study of Ezra, which was later reinforced by the line of Christ, that this work of a people being called out is done in 3 steps with 3 groups. So here you have a message that's unsealed that comes down, and God starts to call out a people. He chooses a messenger who goes to the people and gives a message and calls out a group. And we started to understand that pretty early on. But what happened in 2014 with understanding of Ezra is we realized that it's not just one group of people. There are 3 groups that need to be called out at separate times, at separate stages. So we realized through the study of Ezra that you have the priests, the Levites, and the Nethinims. This was further enforced by the line of, yeah? Did someone say they had a question? Okay. Everyone's muted. Okay. So this was further reinforced by the line of Christ, because we then looked at that line and we saw that you had the apostles or the disciples, then you had them going back to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and then you had them going to the world. So that was also in a 3-step process. Okay. Let's see here. So what we have to do then, because the work of coming out, of a message coming in and removing a people from a place and having them go through the whole cycle of the agricultural process, right? Because this, what we said is we put the agricultural model here and it's a process. And what that agricultural model is showing is the process of the truth coming to a human being, having an effect on the heart of that person until that person grows in the knowledge of that message. This is the literal application of that spiritual model, or which also now, anyways, it's showing the work of the conversion of a person or their understanding of a message to the point where they're ready to be sealed on the right side of truth. So we know that this has to happen for 3 different groups of people, but it's going to happen the same for every single group of people, because this is how the work of that conversion or that taking out of darkness process works, is through the agricultural model. So that means if everyone goes through the same thing, but they go through at different steps or stages, that means that they each go through the same exact process, but in a smaller level. So what we did, you have the priests coming out here in 1989. And if we break up the waymarks and look at how things have panned out, we know where our line ends. And we know the way this had to be, okay, the way we set this up, I think this is really basic, but I really want to spend up some time on here for everyone to understand how we got to this. You have the priest coming out in 1989, and we saw this. Later on, after 2014, once we had this already in place, we had the priest coming out here, and then we had their waymarks in 4 steps. We didn't 100% know where the priest line was going to end. This is just happened, not this year, I think it was last year or 2017. Whenever what's his name? Whenever Parmenter did this in Italy, that's where this first came out, this agricultural model, if you guys remember, with priests, Levites, and Nethinims. Before this, you had heard Jeff say that it's in 3 steps. There's 3 groups, priests, Levites, and Nethinims. But before, he would just say there's priests and Levites, and then there's the world. So priests and Levites were grouped into one category, and the world was in another, because we knew it was two separate groups. First, the message comes to the church, and then the message comes to the world. But what Parmenter showed when he came up with this agricultural model, he said, you have to look at the line of Christ and try to understand some things here. Based off of Ellen White, you know that the harvest of the world happens between the big national Sunday law and the close of probation. So you know that that's where you place their bracket of harvest. So when you come down here for the world or the Nethinims, that's where you can place that, and you can work off of this end to, and I did this wrong. Hang on just a second, because I have a better, there, okay. Sorry, okay, so this is accurate. Yes. Okay, so you know that the Nethinims get harvested out here during the big Sunday law to the big close of probation. So if this is their harvest, then you know that this is where you have to place this bracket of their time. What this does is it pulls their reform line forward. Then we know that for all Adventism, probation closes, or there's a second Advent, but you have everything ends for them here at the big Sunday law. At the big Sunday law, they should already be, ready to go. So we can put theirs here, but we know that for the priests, it started in 1989, so they have to be all the way back here. So based off of some basic information that we know about the second group from Christ's time, and you have from Christ's death to 34 AD, where you had them going to the house of Israel, you know that they came after the priests, and you know that the Nethinims came after the Jews, or the Gentiles came after the Jews. So it has to be in this order of first this one, then this one, then this one. But they all follow the same exact template, but they all also get sealed at different stages. And if you're called out first, you're going to get sealed first. If you're called out second, you're going to get sealed second. You're called out third, you're going to get sealed third. And then priests have another a fourth round of that, basically, kind of. But based off of that, this is then made into a fractal of this line here, and so everything is now set up. So based off of Ezra, and based off of the line of Christ, and based off of the big waymarks that we had already, and based off of the agricultural model, that's how this that we see constantly now, that's how this was put together. So we're going to go back. Let's see here. So does anyone have any questions on that? Does that make sense? Okay. So these groups, like we said, they're actually split into two groups. You have the priests and the Levites, which are in the church, and then you have the Nethinims, which are in the world. The message first came to the church, and then it goes to the world. When does it go to the world in our waymarks? At the Sunday law. So at Sunday law, on the 144,000 line, the gospel message goes to the world. And from the National Sunday Law to the close of probation, it is the harvest of the Nethinims. You wouldn't call these waymarks Sunday Law to close of probation if you were in their fractal line. We don't usually look at it that way, because we personally, as priests, we're living in our line, and that's what we know. And that's the majority of our concern. We broadly understand that they too are undergoing a work, but most of our focus is in trying to split our brains between our priest fractal line and our big 144,000 line, which is where we have a whole bunch of other historical application. So on that big line between Sunday and close of probation is where the harvest of the Nethinims or the world is. That's when the gospel goes to them. So right now we've been very focused on us, but we're about to end. This line of ours is about to end, and we're going to have to jump down into the Levites line and start living through that next. And then we're going to jump down here into this one and live through that. Technically, the only reason these are beneath each other is so that we can see them, but they're stacked actually on top of each other, and it's just one continuous history this way, which is what this line shows up here, which is the 145,000 line. So now the big line of the 144,000 is the history of the end of modern Israel, right? The beginning of it would be the Millerites. So here we're trying to understand the work that has to get done in this reform line. If it is a reform line, then we must have a type to make application on. This is where we go to the end of ancient Israel, right? So you have to go to the place that's the most similar, like what you have now. If this is the end of modern Israel and we're in a glorious land, then you go back in history to where there was an end of a history that was in the original glorious land, and that's ancient Israel, and that would be the line of Christ. So we mark 1989 at the birth of Christ and 9/11 at his baptism. Then we pass over a whole bunch of time and go to 34 AD at the stoning of Stephen, where now the gospel is to go to the world. So we would mark that as Sunday law in Christ time. Now we can line up our lines to Christ line to see how ancient Israel ended and apply that to our time. I hope that makes sense so far. So what we're doing is we have Christ time. You have birth, baptism, the cross, and then Sunday law. And then, I don't know if you'd put destruction of Jerusalem there. I'm not sure, but this, and I don't, this kind of gets into a different type of waymark in our line. But when they go to the world, that's what you have here at 34 AD. So you can mark that on the big line as Sunday law. Baptism, you can mark as 9/11. In birth, you have 1989. But I've heard different applications of this too. But just to make it easy, we're just going to do this. Okay, so by looking at Christ's line, we can discover that there are messengers that come in leadership positions that call out the first group. So First John the Baptist calls them out. So you have a leader that's chosen. As soon as that leader is chosen and given a message, as soon as the message is expounded to the mind of that leader, his mouth is going to start running. And he's going to start calling people out. And what that looks like is basically, he's like, hey, I just did this Bible study. Did you look what I figured out? Did you realize this was in here? In that moment, the first group is starting to be called out. Okay? And it starts at the time of the end. So they first have to, so you have John the Baptist come in, and then you have Christ come in and take over here. And what happens to this first group is that they're supposed to do the work next. So you have two leaders teaching them what to do, and then these guys have to take over and then do the work of calling these people out and these people out. And you know this because what is the point of training these? If you're training them, that means you're getting them ready for something. So something is about to happen when their training is over. They have a work that they have to do when their training is over. So these two are getting these ready to do a work with these two groups. But what's the training? The training is a lot of unlearning of misconceptions. and a lot of learning of what the things, the way they really are. And that's what happened with the disciples in Christ's time, and that's really clear to see. So if they would have been allowed to go to these two groups right away, they would have given them a troubled message, because they were confused themselves. They were human beings in the time that they were living in. They didn't know, things had gotten to a point where they were so amalgamated and confused that, just like we had realized our struggle with conservatism versus liberalism in our time, they had the same issue. And I always thought this, and I wondered this, and it's true, if you look at the difference between the Old Testament and the New, it does seem like a huge liberal shift. And they would have seemed like liberal heathens to the Jews then, in that time, in the capacity that they had an understanding of their politics, whatever they were. So this is the end of ancient Israel, okay? And so you had 3 stages with 3 groups. This is also reinforced in the study of Acts 27, where we can see the U.S. and Adventism ships running through history, starting with 1798, then in 1844 and 1863, and then this runs all the way to shipwreck, which is Sunday law. Right before shipwreck, you see Paul. You have Acts 27:27. Yeah, is it 27? Where you have the Levites, or is it 37? Where you have the Levites being pointed out. So you have that group coming in, and coincidence, it's 273, just like in Numbers. And then you have them at shipwreck at Sunday law going to the world. So there's the 3rd group. So you have all 3 there. So that study reinforces this issue also. So when we draw our 144,000 line, we have this huge long blank space from 9/11 to Sunday law, and it seems empty, which is right here, okay? And it seems empty. However, this is a long period of time, and a lot of history and work happened here, whether we were conscious of it or not. This line in Christ's time was the time from Christ's baptism until 34 AD. Almost the entirety of the Gospels happened in this time period. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are almost totally talking about the whole preparation period of this first group, which happened in this time period, which on this line would be right here. Okay? And that's, the time period where you have the majority, pretty much all the disciples are here now. All of them have been picked out and chosen, and they're following Jesus around now, and they're getting taught. Some of them had some information back here. Some of them didn't. Some of them weren't John's disciples. So you have another witness to say it didn't matter where in this line you came in. If you came in before here, you were a part of this first group. And so they're learning under Christ now, and they're getting taught, and they're getting trained and prepared. So these lines that we have laid out they have a lot of weight to them and evidence behind them. There's a lot more we can lay out to reinforce our 5 waymarks and 4 dispensations. When God calls out this first group, we can lay out to reinforce our 5 waymarks and 4. When God calls out this first group, the way He does it is with a message. A message opens that prepares this group for the next dispensation. For example, you have a message come out in the plowing that prepares them for seed time, which prepares them for the former rain, and on and on. So the way these lines work and what they show in application, everyone understands. Okay, people accept these lines and say that they are powerful. Even those who have just left the message, they still say these lines are powerful. The place where people begin to get unstuck and they start freaking out is when they realize what the implications of this actually is. So another quick thing, I want to go back to that. you guys know the spiritual gifts and great controversy. I was looking at those chapters, and I think I told a couple people this. But another thing to show that the majority of the history happens in this time period, from the book Spiritual Gifts and Great Controversy. Hold on, let me actually pull it up because I want to look at that. Where are you? Okay. So let's see if I can do this. Okay. I know it's kind of off to the side. But this one, she starts off with like a huge intro, but then it gets to William Miller. And then you have the first angel's message, the second, the Advent movement, another illustration, and then you have the sanctuary, and then the third angel's message, these things for Sunday law, and then you have the loud cry, time of trouble, and deliverance of the saints. And then it goes into the earth after. But between the waymarks of here, you have this pretty big history illustrated. And then let's go to Great Controversy. Where did I just miss it? So where is it? She goes through another history. You have the American Reformer. And then you have from an American Reformer to the Snares of Satan. You have, which is right here, you have all these chapters, which is a huge, huge history. And you have Snares of Satan, and I think this one's really interesting. Snares of Satan, a couple more chapters, and then you have the, what is it, the final warning, time of trouble, God's people delivered in the desolation of the earth. So, bam, 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 bam. So the moment you get to the Sunday law, even in the chapters, it starts to go really, really quickly. And then the big history here is also in this time period. So I just thought that was interesting to look at. That the majority of the work is pretty much done now. Well, will be as soon as we get this waymark. But okay, so we have a little bit longer, but it's not far off. And the majority of the journey to Sunday law is pretty much done with. We just have a very little bit ways to go, which is really, really something. So let's see here. Let's see about the implications. So now these three groups are actually, what happened? Where did it go? Oh. So we had this happen, if you guys remember, so let's go back to the implications of the line and what they mean. It's hard to think back and remember before everything happened with the equality shift in our movement and all of that. But that message of equality came in before August in that France meeting with the pants situation. Sister Tess was talking about the equality situation and how we discriminate against people and different things. And everyone was accepting the whole issue of equality, and everyone was saying, yes, we need to have equality. This totally makes sense. I totally agree with it. There wasn't really a peep of dissension anywhere. Everyone was on the same page. And then that night when I was presenting what I had seen in the France ones with the pants, I had made a comment because I thought I was the only one, that it seemed weird that everyone agreed on that subject and we didn't have any kind of arguments on it. And I was like, there has to be a test about it at some point. And a couple other people actually said they were wondering the same thing because we had everyone accepted, but we're like, all right, doesn't there have to be like something along with this? Because everyone, this our test? Because it doesn't seem like a test. Everyone seems to agree with the idea of equality. The problem is we agreed with the idea of it, but we didn't know what that actually manifested itself in real life. So you agree with the idea of these lines, you agree with the ideas that they show and the ideas that are kind of, nebulous, and oh, there's this idea of a close of probation, and there's this idea of a test, and there's this idea of that. I totally understand, I totally agree. But when what that actually looks like is what you're faced with, then when people see the implications, then everything starts to change and people start to freak out. And that's what happened with the whole pants issue. Another example that she gave in this video was this difficulty with implications and these fractals. What do they show us about these three groups? So 2014 to 2019 is the plowing of the Nethinims. In our line, the line of the priest, the message is what plowed us. So it has to be a message for the Nethinims as well that plows them and prepares them for seed time. And then the former and latter rains. But we're not certainly giving the people in the world a message right now. So what's plowing them? This is a big issue that came in. There is a true source of information out there external to us that is doing this work. This external source of information is not a religious source, yet it is giving them the message that is the plowing them. So this issue alone has caused many people to struggle with this message. The fact that God is using the external sources in politics to get those people ready is very difficult for some people to accept. And I was thinking about this as well, because it's hard to go back in time now and try to understand where my mindset was before all this happened, because now it seems so obvious. But if you think about it, it's really interesting. To us now, it seems so obvious that there was a time when we too were in the same mindset, thinking that it was only Satan in all politics, and we had no business getting involved in all that nonsense. So not only that, but if we would ever think to step foot in that world of politics, we would have only considered the wrong stream, the conservative stream, the one that we would be safe in listening to. So things have changed a lot. But our understanding, if you guys remember, was that all politics is controlled by Satan. All external things of the world are controlled by Satan, and we have no business in any of that. And the moment you get near it, you're in danger of losing your soul. And it's interesting to look at that now, realizing how much externally they had right compared to us, and how backwards we were on some of these things. It still kind of blows my mind. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. So the thing is though, and this is what makes me wonder, we have this little time period between Raphia and Panium, which is an extra time period for the priests. And still, I don't know why it's here. If I'm not sure, but it makes me think that there's probably something else really big that we need to get rid of before we can go to the Levites, because it's like this extra section of allotted time to really make sure that the priests are ready to do the work that they have to do. So I'm sure there's going to be something else that's going to test us. And I think it's going to be really important to remember the midnight cry message, because the message in the prior dispensation prepares you for the next dispensation. So if you really accept the message of the prior dispensation, remember, if you agree with the lines and you agree with everything, remember that there's going to come implications that you need to understand when that happens, what's happening. And before you decide to reject it wholesale, remember the pattern that's been forming with this testing situation. Okay, so it's here. This what just happened to us is going to be here to make us strong to go through this dispensation here. So okay, now I'm going to resume from here. I don't have any extra notes on the side, but I'm going to start reading from here, so it'll be easier for you guys to follow along. These notes have been on the website, by the way. but I'll send them out tonight, the transcript. So I want us to consider our reform line, the reform line of the priests. You have 1989 to 2019, the close of probation, shut door. So this is our reform line as a priest, and we understand that 2014 lines up with what waymark. So 2014, the middle waymark is what waymark? It's Sunday law. It's the waymark of Sunday law for the first group of people, because remember, we have the big line on the fractal level in our time for the first group. So if 2014 is the waymark of Sunday law, what are the implications of Sunday law? Again, this is where some people begin to experience heartburn. So when we understand that this movement has been active now for 30 years, beginning in 1989, when we understand that we are 5 years into our Sunday law history and a few weeks from our shut door, it begins to raise very pertinent questions. Questions that have been concerning people for the last few years, and I want to attempt to give an answer to some of those questions. I want to do that not by going back to the history of Christ, but by going back to the history of the Millerites. So just to remind us, the line of the 144,000, first God calls out one group, then the second, and then the third, same as in the line of Christ. I've mentioned, and I will remind us one more time, the lines themselves people tend to agree with. But there are implications that cause people heartburn. I mentioned one of them. There is a message that prepares and plows the first group. Therefore, it's self-evident that there must be a preparation of the second and a preparation of the third. And when you start to consider what the preparation of the third looks like and who does that work, people are troubled. We will come back around at that end of our presentation to discuss that. So just remember that in the back of your head. I want to primarily focus on our history on the line of the priests. So we're in the Sunday law history from 2014, and the Sunday law history, what occurs? If you would go to Daniel 11:41, a side effect of the Sunday law history, you know, at Sunday law, there is a testing message. And what is that testing message? Daniel 11:41, he shall enter also into the glorious land. And many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. So entering into the glorious land is Sunday law, and then many are overthrown. So what do we expect to see at Sunday law? Many are overthrown, and who are the many? If you're already in the hand of the papacy, if you are already in the control of the papacy, can you be overthrown? No. They already have you. The world is not overthrown, so who is overthrown? It must be those that were not under the control of the papacy, those who were free. So if you're a captive of a dictator, you can't be overthrown or taken captive because you're already captive, right? The only people that can be taken captive is the people who are free. So those who are free. So it is not the world, it is God's people. In the history of the priests, the first group they're called out in 1989, the time of the end. They are plowing. 9/11, the seed is sown, and the early rain starts. 2014 begins the latter rain. 2019, the harvest. 5 key waymarks. The middle waymark, which from other studies you may hear identified as midway or midnight, is the waymark associated with Sunday law that begins the swelling of the midnight cry or the loud cry, depending on the history and people you are referring to. 2019, the close of probation, and then finally Panium, the second Advent. So this is our fractal 2014 marking the waymark of Sunday law. So if Daniel 11:41 identifies that at the Sunday law waymark there's a test, and who is overthrown? Those who failed the test, or God's people. So in this history, who is receiving the message? The first group of people. It's this movement. So who is going to be overthrown in this history? So what she's doing is she's applying the overthrown part that happens at the Sunday law down at our Sunday law in a fractal level. So if it says that someone will enter into the glorious land and many will be overthrown, we want to figure out in our time period in 2014, who entered into our movement and who was overthrown, okay? So those who receive the test or the message, they are the only ones who can be overthrown. So if you're looking for an overthrowing, and in our own history of Sunday law, where do you look? Not to the world. It's into this movement. It's not the reform line itself, because we can see this reform line through the weight of so much evidence. In every history, an increase of knowledge, a formalization, and a test. 1989 to 1991, there was an increase of knowledge, a formalization in 1996, and a test at 9/11. 9/11 to 2014, you have the same thing, an increase of knowledge, then formalization, and then a test. In our history of 2014 to 2019, an increase of knowledge, a formalization, and a test. So we have this repeating pattern in every one of these 4 dispensations. There is going to be a message that comes that tests God's people. We can see that in Millerite history, 1798 to 1840, William Miller has an increase of knowledge. It's formalized and then it's tested. The message of Samuel Snow given in July at Boston is increase of knowledge to Concord, and then at Exeter was formalized. October 22nd, they are tested. So we see this repeating pattern throughout history. When we come to our reform line, in each one of these dispensations, God is giving his people a message that they will accept or reject, pass or fail. As I said, this itself, just stating that and seeing the pattern, does not give people heartburn. So you see this pattern. Someone will tell you there's going to be many that fall away. There's going to be a message that comes in that people are going to fight against. And everyone's like, oh, of course, of course. And, everyone accepts it. It is then the implications of that. I want to remind us what disciples said to Jesus when he was taking them through this history in their own fractal. They said to Jesus, his message is a hard saying. Who can hear it? And what do they mean when they say hard? The word hard means of a person. It can mean, if you say a hard person or harsh or stern person. But when you're referring to a thing, it can mean violent, offensive, and intolerable. So what they said to Jesus is, what you're saying is violent, offensive, and intolerable. To their conservative Jewish minds, his teachings seemed violent, offensive, and intolerable because they were so different and so liberal compared to their conservative ideas. So, what are the disciples saying about Christ's message? When they are in this history, in their fractal, they're saying Christ's message is violent, offensive, and intolerable. Who can hear it? In the book of Romans, it's stated, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling block and a rock of offense. So God does not hide that to many people. The message of Christ or Christ himself was a rock of offense designed to offend if they could not see the truth in his message. So we can expect the same thing. The implications of these reform lines, people can find offensive and intolerable. I want us to go back to the Millerite history. We looked very briefly at the history of Christ when we saw the 3 groups. So the disciples, then at Pentecost to the church, and then to the Gentiles in 34 AD. We took that line down and saw the 144,000, the exact same pattern. So we saw that here. So I want us to consider the Millerites. What is the key external issue in the time of the Millerites? The key external issue, I'm not referring to the internal, but externally, there was a key subject that was so controversial to their time. From the time that the United States rises into history from 1798 through 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, the key external issue is all about slavery. It finally comes to its head in the 1860s Civil War. It's this issue of slavery that I want us to discuss. So without directly overlaying, I want us to identify the history of the Millerites and what we can learn from their experience. So we would place it on a reform line. From the time of the end, 1798, I want us to identify the external issues throughout this history as it related to slavery. Ellen G. White is going to write in the 1890s. I want to quote her. This is from Spalding and McGann, 19.6. There's a terrible crisis just before us, through which all must pass. and especially will it come and be felt in blank. My mind has been much troubled over the positions which some of our brethren are liable to take in regard to the work to be done among the colored people in the southern states. There is one point that I wish to lay before those who work in the southern field. Among the colored people, they will have to labor in different lines from those followed in the north. They cannot give to the South and present the real facts in reference to Sunday keeping being the mark of the beast, and encourage the colored people to work on Sunday. For the same spirit that held the colored people in slavery is not dead, but alive today, and ready to spring into activity. The same spirit of oppression is still cherished in the minds of many of the white people of the South, and will reveal itself in cruel deeds which are the manifestation of their religious zeal. Some will oppose in every possible way any action which has tendency to uplift the colored race and teach them to be self-supporting. So the spirit that held the black people in captivity is not gone. It's alive and it's going to become active again. I want us to think about the implications of that. She's talking about the issue of slavery. Slavery is gone, but racism is not. Oppression is not gone. She says it's going to reveal itself in cruel deeds by the white people of the South. What are those cruel deeds a manifestation of? Her words are religious zeal, right here. So think of the implications of that. The cruel deeds exhibited by the South are a manifestation of their understanding of religion. Slavery and oppression in their history was an issue of church and state. I'm going to stop there real quick. So their understanding of rights, of civil equal rights and equality, was based off of their religious understanding. So based on how you understand the Bible, based on how you understand God and what's written in His Word, is what you're going to act out in life and how you're going to operate as a human being. So to the southern states, the way they read the Bible was that there is a section of humanity that they get to treat the way they treat it. So this was based off of their religious, biblical understanding of things that they performed this civil oppression. So this was a church and state issue. It was a religious issue. So in Millerite history, the religious zeal of the churches and the people manifested itself in the issue of slavery, which is why we find it as the key external issue throughout Millerite history. So in our time, and what she's going to point out later, and I want this in your minds because this is very important. In our time, the same problem, if you're going to have a combination of church and state, the things that they're doing that are wrong, it has to be from an understanding of the Bible for them. So they're reading the Bible and they're understanding it incorrectly, and they're making an application in real life where they're forcing their personal understanding of the Bible on the entire nation. Okay, so this is a misconception, this is a misunderstanding, this is I guess like a old school conservative mindset of these things, right? Of their understanding of the Bible that they're trying to apply in our time today. So they're trying to make civil laws based off of their biblical understanding of things. Okay? Do you guys have any questions? Because that's really important. Or any comments or anything? Okay. So, based off of how they understand the Bible, they stick their feet into the Republican Party to try to influence the laws to match their understanding of the Bible. And what their understanding of the Bible is an old school, because it is in there. Okay? How you treat women, how women are supposed to be submissive, Paul wrote pretty clearly about women and what their equality looks like. They're taking that old school, that dispensation's method of treating people, and they're trying to apply it in our time today. And they're trying to influence civil laws to do that with. Okay, so this is how church and state operates. This is how it's working. So we're learning the building blocks of apostasy and how Babylon works here. So this is like basic level. And how did the South defend their understanding of slavery? They used two books. The two books they used to defend themselves and slavery through the Constitution and the Bible. So there's two documents that they misread, the Bible and the Constitution. So in our time, we have to see the same thing, Bible and Constitution. So the South is going to defend slavery through the Constitution and the Bible. If you were to go to Genesis 17:23, and Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all that were born in his house, and all that were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the selfsame day, as God had said unto him. So what is that saying? Who did Abraham circumcise? It was his son. All who were born in his house and all the slaves he bought with his money. Abraham was a slave owner. These other quotes that the South are going to use are strong quotes that they use to defend their practice of slavery. And there are others. So on one, hold on a second. Susan, this slavery issue, a monster, is so very apparent today. I am so thankful for these truths. Thank you for your service today. Yes. This is, when you see the spirit of it, right? When you see the spirit of what that principle is, it is becoming more and more apparent. There was a time where they stealthily hid it, and people were none the wiser except for, the people who were actually watching out, the people who are the Stones, because the Protestants weren't, Adventists weren't. The only people who were keeping an eye on Protestants and the religious laws that they were making were atheists, right? In the form of Americans United against for the separation of church and state. Literally, atheists were the ones doing the job of Adventists. So let that blow your mind for a second. So they were stealthily doing this to the majority of the people of this nation who weren't paying attention. But now that it's in the forefront, and because of Trump, it's plastered everywhere on every news channel, it's forcing people to come face to face with this issue and have to make a choice, because you can't escape it. There's not one human being on the planet who isn't talking about this. So everyone is hearing about it, and everyone is slowly developing the choice in their mind of what they're going to follow. So that's what's happening right now. I forget where I was. I'm going to start. Here, I'll start here. And there are others. So on one side, you find the South arguing for slavery using the Constitution and the Bible. On the other side of this history, you will find, I am going to be vague about it, you will write the North, but it's also Ellen G. White and the Millerites, and they are arguing against slavery, and what are they using? So it's not just the North, but Ellen White and the Millerites, all of them. The Constitution and the Bible. So I'm going to just quote a couple of Ellen G. White passages. The first is the Review and Herald, August 27, 1861, paragraph 4. She's talking about a slave law. She says, at the Roosevelt Conference, when the brethren and sisters were assembled on the day set apart for humiliation, fasting, and prayer, Sabbath, August 3rd, the Spirit of the Lord rested upon us, and I was taken off in vision and shown the sin of slavery. Slavery has long been a curse to this nation. The fugitive slave law was calculated to crush out of man every noble, generous feeling of sympathy that should arise in his heart for the oppressed and suffering slave. It was in direct opposition to the teaching of Christ. So really quick, you guys know that it hasn't happened yet, but Trump is constantly trying to stop states that are what's the word? The states that are deciding to harbor illegal immigrants and keep them safe against the federal government's orders. Not asylum states. What is it?
Sanctuary cities?
Yes, sanctuary cities. Thank you. So, the fugitive slave bill in the South was if a slave escapes from the South into the North. Okay, so you can picture that there's an escapee, an immigrant, if you will, from the South to the North, and someone is harboring that individual. That person can go to jail. So you have the same exact issue today with sanctuary cities who decide that they want to harbor immigrants who make it across and escape their horrible situation in the South, and they come up. And again, the federal government is trying to stop them and put civil liabilities and constraints on them so that they can't harbor people in these circumstances. So you have very strong similarities happening in our time right now. Okay, so God's scourge now is upon the North, that they have so long submitted to the advances of the slave power. The sin of northern pro-slavery men is great. They have strengthened the South in their sin and sanctioned the extension of slavery and acted a prominent part in bringing the nation into its present distressed condition. So the North was also guilty in the situation. And it's interesting that Abraham Lincoln, and if you read some of his speeches, we were doing that in through that McGann book that we're reading in the devotionals. Sorry. He quoted how the founding fathers had to allow states to have slavery just so that we can get this country off the ground. But when he came into power, part of his speech was that I will not take slavery away from the South, but it will be confined only to the states that already have it. You're not going to be allowed to expand slavery into the federal areas. But he was not going to abolish slavery. It was not going to happen. So as long as slavery was not abolished, the first 2.5 years of the Civil War, and this is what I think was actually happening. You have the North losing, and the North thinks that it's because God is out of the government, but it's not. The North is losing because they haven't abolished slavery and put it into law yet. The moment they do that in 1863, they abolish slavery, and now they start to win. They think it's because they added God to the government. But I'm pretty sure this application I don't think has been made, but I'm pretty sure that tide probably turned in their favor from God just because of the fact that they abolished slavery finally. So the issue is that the North has to suffer because they sanctioned it. They sanctioned it and they allowed it for longer than it should have ever been allowed. So while people were trying to keep the peace, God is saying no, no more peace. It doesn't matter what you have to do to these people. You stop slavery now. And they don't. And so they have to suffer in that war. So in our time, I'm wondering if now finally the left in their counter revolution that's coming up, if that's going to be them fighting for the right things, doing what they're supposed to do. I'm not sure how this lines up in ours, but I think it's just interesting to think about. So Ellen G. White is going to condemn slavery using the Bible. She says, many were blinded and grossly deceived in the last election, and their influence was used to place in authority men who would wink at evil, men who would witness a flood of woe and misery unmoved, whose principles are corrupt, who are Southern sympathizers and would preserve slavery as it is. I want to note she is speaking politically. She is making strong political statements relevant to her time. These are just two examples. She speaks extensively on the issue of slavery, but our pioneers, even Joseph Bates in the 1830s, before he even became a Millerite, was an open abolitionist. You find two sides, whether it was the South or the Millerites, on the abolitionists of the North arguing for their position for or against slavery using the same books. So Either side, they're both using the same books, whacking at each other. I want to quote James White in 1862 in the early years of the Civil War. For the past, so really quick, this is why we're formalizing our methodology. This is why you hear Parminder go over and over and over and over again talking about parables and how you're supposed to juggle progressive and line upon line, how to know when to use them, how to use it correctly. Because if you don't use it correctly, you end up reading the Bible as if you were a Southern slave owner thinking that you get to have slaves. So methodology is the difference. The only difference that you have between the North and the South and how they read is methodology. So based off of your methodology of how you read and apply the verses in the Bible is what you're going to make a decision on. That's why you hear in our time now, and Ellen White in her time when she talked about they have the same issue, is how you apply things. You have to have a clear, concise way that is based off of clear, perfect rules to be able to make correct application so that you don't end up on the wrong side, because the test is so grievous and it's so intense and so deceptive that if you don't have a clear way of interpreting and understanding the word of God, it will be so easy to fall off. And that's what Adventism has taken a left turn in methodology wise. They had a few good things, but they failed to progress in knowledge and understanding and how they read things as time went on. And so now they're left on the same side as the Protestants, reading the Bible, coming to the same conclusions that the Protestants are. If you're coming to the same conclusions that the Protestants are when you read the Bible, that means that you're using their methodology to read it. So there's a right methodology and there's a wrong methodology. And everything we have to do is look at the right methodology and learn how to use it. That's why we have to strive so hard and keep practicing at parables and how to use them. Like we said, Sabbath, we're like babies learning to take our first steps. We're really wobbly. We're not that great. Half the time we forget the rules and the order that they go in. But we have to keep trying, because that is the only thing that's going to make the world around us clear and make sense and help us to figure out which side that we're actually on. And this is why you can look at FFA now and how they teach the things that they teach and how mixed up they are and how incorrect things are getting applied out of context, out of order, and you can know that that's where they went wrong. There was a failure to understand methodology, and that led to this separation. And the people who always looked at this message and were confused by it failed to make that step of moving forward to understand this methodology. And if you don't do that, and if you use the methodology of the Protestants, you're going to end up wanting and doing and accepting the same things that they do. So that's my soapbox for today. So James White quote. Okay, the nation. So he's going to go into some political arguments here. For the past 10 years, the review has taught that the United States of America were a subject of prophecy, and that slavery is pointed out in the prophetic word as the darkest and most damning sin upon this nation. It is taught that heaven has wrath in store for the nation, which would drink the very dregs as due punishment for the sin of slavery. And the anti-slavery teachings of several of our publications based upon certain prophecies have been such that their circulation has been positively forbidden in the slave states. Those of our people who voted at all at the last presidential election to a man voted for Abraham Lincoln. We know of not one man among Seventh-day Adventists who has the least sympathy for secession. So we know not one man among Seventh-day Adventists who has the least sympathy for secession. So secession is the people who want to secede from the United States. So no one man among SDAs in that time period was interested in the people I don't know how to read this actually. I don't know if they had sympathy for the secession or yeah, they have no. I actually don't understand what that's saying. Does he mean that they didn't have sympathy for the South, or they didn't have sympathy for? No, because the South was the one wanting to secede, so they didn't have any sympathy for them. Okay, but for reasons which we will here state, our people have not taken that part in the present struggle that others have. So he goes on and actually put the whole thing that he wrote there, but she just focused on the first couple parts, so we're just gonna leave it there. I know they had no sympathy for secession. But what I'm saying is that Abraham Lincoln didn't want the South to secede. He wanted them to stay slave states the way they were, and he wasn't going to abolish slavery. So that's why I'm confused. Oh, okay. I think Susan's got it there. That makes sense. So no sympathy for those who were separating to the South side. That makes sense. Okay, so these were strong political statements for their time regarding this issue of slavery. And they identified slavery as the most damning sin. Pretty sure that's what that means. Okay, so, and they identify slavery as the most damning sin of the United States. Other studies have been done that go through the history quite precisely, but I just want us to see the connection between their own history and our own. In those years from 1798 through the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, and then through the Civil War, they're taking a strong political position about the actions or the sin of the United States, and they identify that sin in their history is slavery. So the issue of slavery is not disconnected from the churches. I want to remind us, and I will keep reminding of that first Ellen G. White quote that we read, where she said that the South in their position on slavery was an exhibition of their religious zeal. So based off of methodology and how they read the Bible, they were so strong in their belief of what they read through their methodology that they were willing to force it on everyone. This is scary dangerous. So that is going to become important when we're going to go see how that issue has progressed through the last 150 years. Here we have one more quote. This is First Testimonies 359.2. Satan was the first great leader in rebellion. God is punishing the North that they have so long suffered the accursed sin of slavery to exist. For in the sight of heaven it is a sin of the darkest dye. Not sure. God is not with the South, and he will punish them dreadfully in the end. Satan is the instigator of all rebellion. I saw that you, Brother A, have permitted your political principles to destroy your judgment and your love for the truth. They're eating out true godliness from your heart. So I just want to make a point here. He is choosing something, Brother A, from our understanding of what's been happening now and our understanding of what the South's position was then. They had a biblical argument. So what Brother A was doing is he was agreeing with their biblical argument, with their understanding and their methodology of interpreting the Bible. And what she's saying is that was incorrect, and they're eating out true godliness from your heart. So there's a methodology that is very Bible based, but instead of helping you, it eats out the truth from your heart. And it's a misapplication out of dispensation of biblical words and truths, right? Because that's what they were doing. They were misapplying out of dispensations things from the Bible into their time. And what it was doing is, even though it was right and it happened in that time in the Bible, now what it does is it eats out the truth from your heart. So you have never looked upon slavery in the right light, and your views of this matter have thrown you on the side of the rebellion, which was stirred up by Satan and his host. So if you have the view that the Bible says if you don't work, you don't eat, and you need to this and you need to that, and that's why immigration is wrong and people shouldn't be coming to this country, turning it into a dump and all these things because they're lazy. If this is what your Bible is telling you to think, you just made a huge mistake. This is what I'm saying is an application of our time, but it could, I don't know, something else. This is just what I'm saying. So your views of slavery cannot harmonize with the sacred, important truths for this time. You must yield your views of the truth. Both cannot be cherished in the same heart, for they are at war with each other. If they're at war, they're completely opposite also, I might add. So this external political issue of slavery was what to them? It was a test. They either relinquished their political views or they would be forced to yield up the views of the Millerites of the movement. You could not cherish the prophetic understanding of the message and pro-slavery views in the same heart. One must be surrendered. Reminding us in the 1890s, slavery, the spirit of it, is not dead, but will continue to manifest itself. One way it manifested itself after this history, and we place Millerite history extending through the 1863, which is the history of the Civil War. Again, slavery being the key issue of that time. One of the ways you find that that oppression was able to continue was in the history of the 1890s. So in the 1890s, there are leading people who are trying to find a way to make sure that the Black population is still subjugated. They come up with a doctrine which they call separate but equal. This is written into law. So in the 1890s, in the history when Ellen G. White is saying that those racist principles still exist, they come up with this law of separate but equal. And what they're saying is that Black and whites are equal. Black is equal to white, but they are to be separated. And every time you say equal but, what are you really saying? You are not equal. That is why when you find this placed into law, which in one word was segregation, this is where segregation came from. It all began in the 1890s with this law that said that Black and white are equal but must be kept separate. Separate schools and separate hospitals and colleges, separate doors to enter into. They must be separated. This law continued from the 1890s to the middle of the last century in the 1950s. So I want us to go back, to backtrack a little in our history and see this issue is connected to our own day. The 1890s, they placed segregation into law. That continues through decades into the early 1950s. I will begin with the 1951. Back in 1951, there was a group of Black families in the United States. So you have 1951 to 1954. In 1951, a few Black families came together in the United States and they decided that they did not want their children receiving an improper education. A consequence of this separate but equal, is that there really is no equal. And when there is no equal and they are separated, the white schools got the funding and the Black schools didn't. The Black families that came together in the early 1950s said, our children deserve an equal education. Therefore, we should have the right to send them to a white school. This is the court case, one of the most famous court cases in U.S. history, known as Brown versus Board of Education. One of the most famous court cases in U.S. history. First, they sued their local school district to allow their white children I'm pretty sure that meant, I have to fix this, hang on. Children to attend school, and they lost that court case. So then they took it to the Supreme Court, and in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that this doctrine of separate but equal and segregation violated the Constitution, and segregation was ruled to be illegal. This is where segregation began to end, by the Supreme Court. So it was the work of these families and their attempts to educate their children that began to remove segregation from the United States society. But there was a problem. The spirit of slavery still existed in the churches of the South. This caused a violent, aggressive response by the religious right of America. Again, the slavery of the South was a manifestation of their religious zeal. It was based on their understanding of religion, that they are somehow on an elevated status to others. I think she goes into this, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly. So this beginning of ending of segregation greatly angered the evangelical leaders. Yeah, she's going to go into it now. The evangelical leaders in America of that time. I'm going to mention a couple of them to you. A couple of those key leaders were so against sending their white children to desegregated school. They were so sure that they did not want their children to interact with black students that they began to set up universities in the South, private universities. So after segregation begins to end in the history of 1954, which was a violent issue enough. This is so between this time when the Supreme Court rules that segregation ends and the time when they start to make these private universities, there's a lot of time that passes and there's a lot of violence and mess that happens with trying to segregate these people in the first place. And then they decide, they see that the federal government isn't giving in, so now they are going to make their own private universities. One of them that we will speak about is Liberty University. Before that, it was known as Lynchburg University, and it's in the South, and you know where they get that name from. That's how deep racism existed in the South, but they changed the name, ironically enough, to Liberty University. This university was created and run by a key man in this history known as Jerry Falwell, one of the most leading evangelicals of that time period. It's not just him. Many private universities spring up in the South just as segregation is ending. Because it is a private university, the government cannot force you to desegregate. Only the public universities were being desegregated. So if they formed a private Christian university in the South, they were free to practice segregation. But then the government steps in. The government stepped in around the 1960s and 70s and started to pressure these private Christian universities. And the government said to them is that if they wanted to have segregated schools, Christian evangelical Christian schools in the South, that's okay. But they were no longer tax exempt and they were going to have to start paying taxes. So the government began to remove their tax exempt standing. They did not want to start paying taxes. Nothing changes. That would be detrimental to their schools. This created a wave of anger throughout the Christian right in the north, in the nation, but particularly in the South. So if any of you know the movement in the United States, it's been particularly centered in the state of Arkansas. And in the state of Arkansas, there's this town known as Little Rock. When segregation ended and as public school was to allow in black students, what was the response? Those southern white schools were so against desegregation, it blocked the school and the government was forced to send in the army. And you have these little black children, just children being led to school every morning for a year by the United States Army. That was how much they had to force the schools to desegregate. But the government keeps adding pressure. Arkansas is in the South. It has that continuing legacy, but these are these southern universities, and when the government says that they're going to take away their tax exempt status, they begin to politically mobilize. And this is where it leads into where we are today. Jerry Falwell begins to meet with the leading evangelical leaders of the United States. They decide that it's time to no longer submit to the dictates of the government. Because of their religious zeal, the same religious zeal that you find in the history of slavery by the South, the same religious zeal in this history is going to drive them to start interacting with the government. Not all the government, but the Republican Party. So what this says, just think about this for a second. Their understanding of things is capable of how do I say, commingling or attach itself basically in principles to only one of the two parties. So you have two options, and one of them is more conducive to the same thought process as evangelicals, conservative evangelicals, than the other. So you know, based off of who the evangelicals choose, that that is the wrong people. So if they chose Republicans, you know. So they took strong conservative positions against not just race, but also gender, and also their approach to homosexuality. Jerry Falwell once said that a gay-friendly church in New York would one day be utterly annihilated, and heaven would celebrate. He said homosexuals are brute beasts, so they had this language through a few different issues, particularly when it came to homosexuality, when it came to gender. But what particularly galvanized the religious right was the civil rights movement and desegregation. I'm going to quote from a news article written more recently that has covered some of this history. For Jerry Falwell in the 1970s, the question that he was attacking, the beginning of what we know today as a culture war, was desegregation. Oh, who did this? I'm going to read this thing Susan just posted. On Monday, I took Mom to her physical therapy appointment. At the facility, while we were in the waiting room waiting to be called for Mom's session, a lovely black lady began to just talk to us. She admired how Mom and me were interacting with each other. She really took to us. I'm sure it was the Lord's Spirit. When we were leaving and going to our car, she was also in the parking lot and wanted to say goodbye to us. I mentioned that I was taking my mom to see Harriet next. This lady, Ayana said she was going to see it too. The movie, Harriet the movie, okay. She met us there, and we had a really good talk about slavery and racism, the Trump presidency, end of the world stuff. She was blown away by what I could talk to her about, like Brown versus the Board of Education, etc. She asked for my phone number. I've been in communication with her every day since Monday. This could only have been made possible because of the Holy Spirit in this movement. Okay, message. Awesome. That's so cool. Praise the Lord. Yeah. Wow. I am telling you, this, I have to say, I've been having similar experiences with people from work or people who I encounter anywhere, and we get to talking, and they're understanding what's going on, and they're freaked out by it too. It's like immediately you have a camaraderie, and you start like it. I don't know how to. It's like you start like clinging to each other, like what's happening. You know, you tell me what you know, and I'll tell you what I know, and we'll figure it out, kind of thing. It's crazy, and there's people from work that I've been talking to about AOC and Trump and everything that's happening. There are so many people who see what's happening and they understand it so well. I remember before this equality and the whole two streams, before the two streams message came out, the liberal versus conservative thing, before that was really clarified, I remember going to work and one of my coworkers came up to me and he said, you should really look into AOC. She's got this Green New Deal and it's amazing. And I looked at him like he was crazy and off his rocker, and he just, meandered on away. And I just like shook my head and I'm like, he doesn't have any idea what's happening. That's literally the thoughts that went through my head. And now I'm asking him about this lady, what all he knows about her. And I'm just like, what happened? What happened? Like, how did we get it so wrong for so long? I don't even, ugh. And it's so scary because there's so many people suffering because of just one kind of mindset. And it's so, we have to do everything we can to change, to be able to not just not even to help, but just to not oppress people anymore, not to make them feel uncomfortable around us and judged. Just that is hard enough for us. So, but we have a long way to go. So I felt the same way, Adriana. We were screwed up in our thinking. Yeah. So God's trying to change us around to keep us from doing damage to these people. So that's pretty incredible. So they took strong conservative positions against not just race, but also gender, and also their approach to homosexuality. I already read all this. Okay. So paraphrasing, she's quoting someone now. Falwell was a rabid segregation. Okay, so real quick, the way she starts going in and out of articles, she sometimes doesn't even say that she's doing it, or sometimes she won't even say what the name of the article is. I try to copy and paste word for word what she says into Google, but sometimes she doesn't even exactly like quote what she's saying, so I can't even get the accurate article. So I did my best. A lot of areas I just ended up copying what she was saying, and I have no source of where to get it. So it is what it is. I'm sorry, but she goes into off to some. It sounds like she's reading the article word for word, but she's not. And I know this because I've tried to find those things and I couldn't. And it's when I do find them, there's words missing that she wasn't saying, and I'm like, oh man. But anyways, so she's paraphrasing here. Falwell was a rabid segregationist and railed against the civil rights movement from the pulpit. I want to quote Jerry Falwell, that leading evangelical, on the Supreme Court decision to ending segregation. He said that if those justices of the Supreme Court had understood God's word, if they would have understood the Bible and the will of God, they would never have ended segregation. So remember, this is him manifesting his religious zeal. So this is his understanding through how he applies Bible scriptures and applications, okay? So based off of his understanding of the Bible is what he's deciding how to rule on the segregation issue. So let's read that one more time. He said that if those justices of the Supreme Court had have understood God's word, if they would have understood the Bible and the will of God, they would never have ended segregation. So he said the will of God is that the races be separate. And you know he's getting that from the old school scriptures, not the dispensation, what they had before it progressed to freedom. Because they had a time period where there was slavery, there was separation, there was clean people and unclean people, there was the Jews and there was the Gentiles. And that's what they're trying to apply to our time, that same separationist thinking. They're trying to apply to our time, okay? So it's religious zeal that they're trying to put in civil law. What is he justifying his beliefs on? They use the Constitution and their understanding of the Bible. And they said segregation is a Bible principle, and they have verses for that. Jerry Falwell said the true black person does not want integration. He realizes his potential is far better in his own race. Falwell went on to announce that integration will destroy the white race eventually. In one northern city, he warned, he had this white friend who was a pastor, and next door to him lived a mixed race couple. He says this was with anger and surprise that in the north, a pastor friend of his has a mixed race couple living next door to him. Through the 1960s, as you find the civil rights movement begin, you find the Christian right galvanized, and Falwell began to learn more and more, to lean more and more on conspiracy theories. And you have to, because evidence for this garbage nonsense doesn't exist. So you have to go to conspiracy theories to make your point. Another element you find used, and also these conspiracy theories, like you see with Trump today, what they do is they attack the gut animal instinct, the visceral part of the person, not the logic and reason. And they affect you based off of a fear response. And that's what kind of theories and ideas they use to make people make the decisions they want them to make. So another element you find used by the Christian right. So he said that Martin Luther King was a communist spy. Remember, they're in the Cold War right now. And if you ever Google or YouTube the fear mongering that was happening in the McCarthy era with everyone, they were trying to find communists, but they were acting more like communists in that endeavor because everyone was spying on each other. Everyone was what's it called? I need that word. what's that word? Wow, I can't even find it. So everyone was freaking out that everyone around them was communist, and what if this person is communist, what if that person is communist? um it was this fear that was instilled in the people in the McCarthy era, right? So this religious leader uses that fear that was going around in that time, of the fear of communists, and he said that Martin Luther King was a communist spy. He had zero proof. But this, in conspiracy theories, you don't need proof. All you need is a subtle little suggestion. That's all you need. So he says that the leaders of the civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr., James Farmer, and others, had left wing associations. They were obviously communist, and they were doing all they could in their part of the world to take advantage of the American situation and exploit every incident to bring about violence and bloodshed. So, using conspiracy theories also in his repertoire, he was also regularly attacking Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. Okay. Yeah, same tactics today, where the people where the people don't know what to believe, all seeds of doubt in people. Yeah, and it's really hard to reason with that. It's really hard. So Susan says that era was really like a witch hunt. Yes, Trump's first attorney, Roy Cohn, was the assistant to McCarthy to give the Rosenbergs the death penalty. Yeah, I went back and I watched videos on Roy Cohn, and they I cannot. Every single picture of McCarthy was with Roy Cohn whispering in his ear. Always. And it was like creepy to see. It was creepy to see. But that's the same thing we have happening now. It's literally not any different. And this is what I was saying. I don't remember when I was saying this. Probably one of our mornings. But it's like the argument, the way they argue, and this is the only way that I can try to explain it to people who believe in this stuff, to try to help them to think about what is actually happening when with these words. It's a word game, and it's bringing subtle ideas in with these words, and saying it in a way that implants it into your head, even though you know it's not true and it's really far-fetched and it makes no sense. For some reason, it just sticks in there. And what they do is, you have a person, a coworker, you know them, they're a decent human being, but you don't follow them home at night. You don't know what they do, right? And let's say there's a forest next to their house. One day they do something that angers you, and you decide that they're a bad person, and you decide to make something up and say, I heard that this person skins alive and tortures animals in the forest at night. And you keep repeating it. It sounds crazy. It makes no sense. You have zero evidence. But there's also no evidence that they don't do that, because nobody is following them into the forest in the middle of the night. So neither the accuser has evidence to prove it, and the defender doesn't have evidence to discount it either. So it's like this looming idea that's now in the air, and based off of how convicted you are when you say this, it implants itself into people's brains, and they start to believe it slowly over a long period of time. That's why this reasoning is so messed up and so just evil. So I've been thinking about that a lot, because if you're going to try to, there's people that I know that aren't seeing this, that I wish they would, and I'm trying to figure out how to talk to them and just show them what's happening. And it's so hard to try to pop someone out of that mindset. I think only God can do that. There's literally no way I can, like, I don't even know. It's been, oh man, it's not easy. It's such a, well, there's words I'm forgetting that I need to use, but yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to keep reading. They lost that fight within the civil rights movement, and he began to retreat from publicly stating those views. So they lost against the civil rights movement. It happened. People got their rights, and they got to a point where the Republican Party or the evangelicals were racist in TV shows and everywhere you look were so shamed that they hid their racism from the world. They just kept it inside and they didn't say anything. Okay? So these academies, Lynchburg Academy and then Liberty University, what they changed their name into were particularly private schools for white students started by those evangelical leaders, particularly segregated academies as an open attempt to circumvent the integration. There are a couple of other leaders in this period. We could discuss Paul Weyrich, a leading evangelical of that time. Pat Robinson is another one. Billy Graham was less vocal with siding with them on these issues, but we will discuss the political views of his children. Paul Weyrich was trying to bring together these leading evangelicals, and he said he was trying to unite the evangelicals or the Christian right on the issues of abortion and homosexuality and different issues. But he said what particularly united the Christian right in the 1970s was not abortion, as they try to say today, but the civil rights movement and the issues of segregation. This is no longer socially acceptable, so they can't be seen saying such a ridiculous thing because it's considered extremely disgusting. Does that they still feel it, they just don't say it. Manoa says this is great, and Susan says if you tell a lie big enough, yeah, and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. Exactly. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. Whoa. I don't know who Joseph Goebbels is, but that's on point. Where was I? Okay, so what's propaganda? He was Hitler's communication director. Whoa. What's propaganda, Jackie? I'm confused. Okay. That's very interesting.
Yeah, propaganda is telling this lie over and over again to convince people of a certain truth that isn't truth at all. It's just propaganda out there.
Yeah.
And people just get completely absorbed with it. And then they don't know what to believe, as I said earlier. And then they throw the whole thing out and say, oh, forget it. I don't know what the truth is anyway. And it probably doesn't, I don't even care.
Yeah. But you have to wonder, because there's certain things, when you hear them, you know they sound ridiculous, but what was in there in you that made you want to hang on to that idea? What was it? What was going on? I'm wondering that, because I didn't like the whole racism and all of this stuff. But why was I more, man, I keep trying to figure out where I went wrong when I was on that conservative side, and it's been driving me crazy. But yeah, propaganda, bad propaganda, just repeating it over and over again, it just implants, it digs in. It digs in, and that's the problem with the two streams of information. Wherever you spend the majority of the time is the ideas that get implanted into your head. So whatever they say over and over and over and over again, that's what's going to stick in there. And to try to get that out, I mean, it's like that one Russian video with that Russian guy we saw way back with the Putin thing. I forget what his name is. But he said that they're not going to believe that what they're doing is wrong until someone's stepping on their throat. That's how brainwashed they are. It's unbelievable. And yep. You even had during the Holocaust, Jews in disbelief. They didn't even believe what was happening to them, and they were making excuses, some of them, while it was happening to them. Oh, they're gonna put us in these nice little apartments over here. It's okay, it's gonna be fine. Nothing bad is gonna happen, because they say everything is gonna be fine. You know? And there was people like, no, they're gonna kill us. They're gonna kill us. They're not gonna. We're dying. Like, it was, just just think about how history is repeating.
It is.
And
Yes.
then Jonathan said fake news, and that's crazy because they're the fake news, but they're the ones calling everyone else fake news to discredit them. And so out the get-go, you can't even say anything to anyone because there's already this idea of fake news attached to the true stream of information. So it's just incredible. And then,
That is so true.
yeah,
Oh, absolutely. I know. I have a friend that we're talking about politics and what's going on. She's watching the impeachment thing and with Trump, but she says, oh, they're all crooks anyway. And so they lump it all together and say, well, look, there's no truthfulness out there because they're all crooks. Put it all in one box, you know? Oh, I said, no, there is a true stream of information coming through. If you
can you
just listen and open your ears and eyes.
have you watched the recent the camp meeting that they had in Australia? The videos that have been coming out, the
One
one
is
that
it?
Harminder made a really good point. He said, we're not understanding what perfection looks like. You have your whole entire life, and some days you wake up in a really bad mood. Sometimes you struggle with depression and you don't act as perfect as you think you are. But the issue is that you don't do everything correct all the time. But when it matters, when it's a principle, the situation, and when it counts, you do the right thing and you stand up for the right thing on the issue that is the test for that time. So if you're going to say that Fox News is fine because sometimes they do right things and CNN is wrong because sometimes they do wrong things, or Hillary Clinton is a crook because some of the business deals she did sometimes were shady, you're not understanding what perfection looks like. There is one test for us right now, and depending on where you stand on that test is what decides your perfection level for our dispensation. That blew my mind because I never thought about it that way. And he said that we're stressing out, and we don't know. We don't even know if God accepts us until God tests us and we see what side of the issue that we end up on. And that is when now you finally know that you're with God on the right side because you finally passed the test that he set for you. And that's how he decides whether you're perfect or not. So that was a very incredible video.
Amen. Yes.
So
That's one of the newer videos then.
yeah. It might have been the Great Test. It's literally called the Great Test.
Great
So
test
yeah, go watch
for
that
that one.
Um, it was
Amen.
incredible, man. I mean, we have to, all our focus has to be on this issue right now. When we study, we have to really try our hardest to learn parables and methodology and do it very precisely so we don't mess that up. And we have to just, stop nitpicking at people for different little things and focus on the big test at hand because it is big enough. It is big enough for people to fall on. It's big enough for every single person in this movement to have areas where they struggle with on it. It's taking all of our time and energy just to get through this one big test, and there's different things that I think are helpful to get through things easier in our lives that are personal issues you have to deal with or things overcome, whatever. But in our relationships with each other's, talking back and forth and all of this has to be our focus. So I just that was a really incredible video and it made so much sense. So you know, Satan got it to a point where you're living in a fog of doubt that God loves you or cares about you or accepts you. And so these tests are actually God's mercies to show us, look, I'm telling you, if you just pass this test, I'm telling you that I love you and accept you. This is just a sign for you to understand that I'm with you on your side and there with you. So it was a fantastic video. You guys gotta watch it if you haven't yet. Susan said propaganda information, especially of a biased or misleading nature. Yeah, because there's good and bad propaganda. Propaganda is just information that you give to your enemies. So it depends if it's based in truth or error. but used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point to view. Yes. Yeah, Susan, go watch that. I'm telling you, everyone go watch that video if you haven't. It's called The Great Test. So, I think we read this because they lost their, yeah, good. So they lost their segregation battle. Now they're going to be quiet. They're not going to talk about race. Now it's going to be gender and homosexuality that they focus on. So Paul Weyrich said in the 1970s, we must have new political philosophy, the Christian right. Yeah, hold on just a second, Tiffany, let me find that. I'm pretty sure. I'm in Australia, Scotstown. The oh, okay, it's called What is the Great Test? It's video number 12. Yeah, Susan, thank you. Yeah, What is the Great Test? Video number 12. No problem.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you for that.
No problem. It was a huge blessing, and I think you guys will love it too. So Paul Weyrich said in the 1970s, we must have new political philosophy, the Christian right. It must be defined by the conservatives in moral terms, packaged in non-religious language and propagated throughout the country by a new coalition. When political power is achieved, the moral majority will have the opportunity to recreate the United States. As a leader of that organization that they founded in 1979, Jerry Falwell began to lead it. They founded this organization in 1979. They named it the Moral Majority. It existed for 10 years, from 1979 to 1989. Hang on just a second. Yeah. Okay. So, to 1930. They named it the Moral Majority. It existed for 10 years, from 1979 to 1989, when it dissolved. So, I want to talk, the civil rights movement went from 1954 to 1968. Also in 1969 is when Stonewall happened. Hang on just a second. Okay, I want to give a landscape of the time period. 1948 was women's suffrage movement began in the U.S. There was another wave of it because there was one before. And then 1954 to 68, you have the civil rights movement. And then Stonewall was, yes, gay rights in 1969. And that grew into its own huge thing. So that whole time period is just wave after wave after wave of human rights movements that the South just cannot handle. They backlash against it. So Jerry Falwell quoted, he said that their mission was to train and mobilize and electrify the religious right in America. Quoting him, we were fighting a holy war. We need to lead the nation back to the moral stance that made America great. And there it is. We need the Christian right, need to wield influence on those who govern us. I want to, really quick, we need to wield influence on those who govern us. So then who governs who? You govern yourself if you're wielding the influence over who governs you. If you're the boss of your boss, you're your boss. Anyways, I want us to be reminded of a statement of A.T. Jones. A.T. Jones says the Constitution or the government, who were they designed to protect? This is quoting A.T. Jones. Isn't it peculiar that an altogether singular and new doctrine that the government of the people are there to protect the majority. So he's saying, isn't this a new weird thing that people are saying? Because from whom are they protecting the majority? From themselves, most assuredly, because by their own representation, they are so vastly the majority that it would be impossible for them to be oppressed by anyone else. So why, if you're the one who's the majority and no one can oppress you, who are you protecting yourself from? So the protection guaranteed in our constitutional provisions means protection for the minority. The majority can protect itself. Constitutions are enacted for protecting the weak against the strong, the few against the many. So the Constitution of the United States government is there to protect the minority, not the majority. But because you see the issue of segregation and the civil rights movement, this is what unites the religious right together. In 1979, the religious right from an organization, form an organization called the Moral Majority, headed by Jerry Falwell, who we discussed previously. Jerry Falwell said that their first mission was to elect a conservative American president. They had their first victory in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. They had much to do with this election victory. First victory is Reagan. Second victory in 1988 with the election of George Bush Sr. 1989, Jerry Falwell dissolves the Moral Majority and he says, we have completed our mission. We have electrified the religious right and we have placed in government who we need. He knows that by 1989, which is the time of the end of this movement, they have already accomplished their purpose. They have begun a course that now cannot be turned with the election of Reagan and Bush and the uniting of their religious right in America. So they find that they begin to be disappointed with even Reagan and Bush. It wasn't time yet. They weren't to be the ones, okay? So these conservative presidents aren't as radical as they were expecting. They aren't implementing the moral stance of their religious right when it comes to race and gender and homosexuality, as much as these leaders had envisioned. So you come to 9/11 and you find a crisis. 2001 to 2001, 9/11, all of a sudden, all the evangelical leaders begin to unite again. One evangelical leader, who more of late has had a great deal to do with Donald Trump, she is an evangelical leader in our time with a mega church, a prosperity gospel speaker. But she spoke that in 9/11, they all united because they all began to share what message? In 2001, you have the children of Billy Graham who said we would speak of before. His daughter Anne says that 9/11 or the attack on the Twin Towers was a judgment of God. It's God's judgment. He is allowing this to happen because we're shaking our fist in God's face. They aren't going to attack the race issues. That is too toxic now. They can't be open with their issues of racism. Instead, she begins to say it is because of immorality, homosexuality, and feminism. So down to 9/11, you have two sides. I want us to be reminded in this history, when you have all of these issues and this religious doctrine of slavery, which is what it was to them, when you have the religious doctrine of slavery and the Sunday law issues, who is protesting all through this history, whether it's slavery or the Sunday law issues? Who's protesting? It's the Millerites. It's Ellen G. White, A.T. Jones, all through this history, whether it was the issue of slavery or Sunday keeping. Our pioneers protested and fought against those issues. Who is protesting in this history of 1979 to 1989? It's not Adventists. What state are we in? We are in Laodicean condition. We are sleeping and in darkness. Laodicean Adventists do not see the importance of this history, the changes in U.S. government, the galvanizing of the religious right. Adventists don't see it. And when God's people are silent, what happens? The stones begin to cry out. So the protest you find happen in this history is not from God's people. Instead, from 1948, you see a different protest start, and that is an organization in America known as Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. They form in 1948, which is also when the women's rights. That's interesting. So it has been Adventists who have protested throughout this history. So it hasn't been Adventists who protested throughout this history. It has been the Stones crying out. This organization is a key one, who even in our history are one of the most vocal crying out against the church and state union that is occurring today. In 2001, you see these unite. Jerry Falwell, Pat Robinson, the two children of Billy Graham at 9/11, saying that this is the judgment of God because the U.S. has rejected the morality of the majority. Again, we begin to see church and state become an issue in our history. What has been in our history today. There have been studies that cover these histories in a great detail. I want to move past some of that. I will refer you to those studies if you wish to see it, and we will also review some at camp, but just as seeing in our history what has been happening. 2014 is what waymark for us. It's Sunday law. So you know there is going to be an issue with church and state. This issue, what I am hoping we can see, is not particularly under the work of leading evangelicals. I want to name one leading, something went wrong here. Is not particularly, no, is not disconnected. Okay, hold on a second. This issue, what I'm hoping we can see, is not disconnected from the same issue that galvanized the Millerites. Instead, what we have been finding from 2014, particularly under the work of leading evangelicals, I want to name one leading Catholic evangelical, Steve Bannon, is that you again find that he is engaging in a culture war trying to enforce the morality of the majority through the government of the nation. So she just compared Steve Bannon to Jerry Falwell. Okay? So you have a type of how Protestants go to influence the state to bring in the laws that they want, and Jerry Falwell in 1979 to 1989. And so now, when you see Steve Bannon doing what he's doing, you can clearly associate that back then. And it was clearer then when it was against civil rights. And it's harder to see now. But if you put them next to each other, you see they're the same thing. So it helps a lot in understanding Jerry Falwell, moral majority, what galvanized them, what caused them to come and spring into action. You can know that it's the same things that are motivating Steve Bannon. So in 2014, that process begins. Internally, we know that 2014 is our Sunday law. There's a message that begins here, that begins to swell. There's an increase of knowledge and a formalization of the midnight cry and a test November 9, 2019. These two waymarks are 2016 and 2018, increase of knowledge and formalization respectively. So internally, this is the beginning of a message that is going to swell into the midnight cry. 2016 also being a waymark. So externally, what is it? Externally, you see the issues in the United States. It all begins in 2014 with the work of Steve Bannon. Then externally, it begins to swell. 2016, the election of Trump. 2018, unrestrained. 2019, dictatorship. So what propelled Donald Trump to power beginning from 2014? It was the Christian right. Specifically, in this history, what began our reform line with Reagan and Bush was Jerry Falwell. In 2016, remember, we're typing Jerry Falwell and Bannon. In 2016, the religious right in the U.S. threw their full political support and backing behind Donald Trump as a presidential candidate. Who led that was Jerry Falwell Jr. The father began, okay, so he's also involved. The father began our reform line with bringing church and state and the election of Reagan and Bush. And then we find from 2014 through our reform line, the final president of the United States won the election with 81% of the evangelical vote, all led by the son of Jerry Falwell, Jerry Falwell Jr., and the full support of Liberty University. In our history today, let me just stop real quick. Steve Bannon has talked at Liberty University. Different people like Ben Shapiro have spoken at Liberty University. You look at the lineup of speakers that have spoken at the commencement ceremonies of Liberty University, and you're going to find a lot of faces you're going to recognize, I think. I finagled around on YouTube and stumbled onto some things at some point. I don't remember how or what it was called. But it's, you know, who's supporting that side and what they stand for if they're speaking at Liberty University for Jerry Falwell Jr. So in our history today, I just want to reference something that happened recently. There was a mass shooting. Do this. There was a mass shooting in America. What do you find the religious right saying? And when I say the religious right now, I am hoping people have watched enough to know that I'm also referring to Fox News. In Fox News, you have leading speakers on a news channel saying that the reason there is a mass shooting is because Americans need to repent, because our culture has created a division between us and God where we have hate and immorality inside the heart that has disconnected ourselves from God, and we have lost our values. They're saying it because of lack of morality that there are these mass shootings. Remember, they have a very biblical based political argument. So it sounds like they're saying something that sounds good, but in its core principle, it's wrong. And you're not going to see it unless you have the correct methodology. Susan says it seems likely that a good rule of thumb that if they say liberty, it's just the opposite. Yeah, like the Patriot Act was not anything a patriot would believe. Good point. Where was I? Their value. Let's start here. They are saying it because of lack of morality that there are these mass shootings. Keeping in mind that most of those mass shootings are by white supremacists. And where do they get that from? So there's a response made by the South African commentator. He hears that, and his response is, in the 1960s, God told evangelicals that white and black people shouldn't mix. So why are the white evangelicals saying that whites and blacks shouldn't mix in that history, and then expecting that they know the social ills of our time? So you can see why they're not being listened to anymore. In closing, yeah, are we in closing? No, it goes on for, okay. We're getting close. Sorry, this is going so late. So in closing, from the history of the Millerites, we find the issue was slavery. From 1798 all the way through the Civil War, history marking the end of their reform line in 1863. That's what they fought against and saw as the primary sin of the nation. You come to the history of the 1890s and you find Ellen G. White saying that that spirit still exists and will lead to oppression. And that history, segregation is placed into law. That segregation exhibits itself through those decades as the forced separation of black from white. This all ends in the 1950s with the court case, Brown versus Board of Education. This reunited the religious right to form these conservatives, universities, and mobilize as a political force. That mobilization was the moral majority of this 10-year history leading to the time of the end. From 1979 to 1989, they united particularly with the Republican Party. Reagan, a Republican president, Bush, a Republican president, and by 1989, Jerry Falwell says, we have succeeded in our mission. Really quick before I lose my thought. So 2014, you have Steve Bannon from the aftershock of 9/11. He's still functioning based on that. But you don't have Project Blitz until after that. I think it's 2016 when Project Blitz starts to get mobilized. Am I right on that? Because what happened in 2015? You had gay marriage passed because of Obama. And immediately after that, you had such a strong recoil from the religious right, where you heard non-stop stories about people refusing to marry gay people based off of their religious convictions. So that had a huge effect on them. You can bet for sure it helped. And the fact that it happened right before the 2016 election, you know it's not a coincidence. It helped propel them over the edge because they could not stand them having rights, especially that right, because of how they interpret things and freedom and all of these. So 1996, you see the formalization of Fox News. Fox News is the mouthpiece of these conservative leaders. Through this history, 9/11, that's who is sharing that message. You come to 2014, there is the Sunday Law. It is a point of test. And what is the unspoken but obvious sore point for leading conservative evangelicals in America here? Tracing where they have come from, you have a black president in the White House. So from his election through to 2014, you can see Fox News and those leading evangelicals becoming more and more active and hostile. They've been tested. Why did God choose this point in history to give America a black president? If it wasn't to poke them where it hurt, it was a test. And in this history under Obama, how is he treating the religious right? He's not giving them any political power, so they decide it is time to regain the political power that they had started to lose. Particularly the work of Steve Bannon in 2014. That begins to work to bring about a conservative Republican president of outside even the Republican establishment. So he is looking for an extremist, and Bannon hasn't hid that at all. He's been very clear. He wants someone to explode everything. So 2016, he succeeds in that work, but he does that with 81% of the evangelical vote. This, in the time of the end history, is Jerry Falwell, and in 2016 is the work of Jerry Falwell. So the excuse being used by the Christian right, and I want us to be careful with how personal this becomes. In slavery history, they're using their understanding of the Constitution and the Bible to defend their issues relating to equality. You find that in 1865, Abraham Lincoln is killed. Why is he killed? The man that killed him was pro-slavery, but he didn't own slaves. What did he say? What had upset the assassin of Abraham Lincoln was not just the ending of slavery, it was that he felt that he no longer had his free speech. He felt like the North had taken away his free speech so that he could no longer say, I believe in slavery, and feel comfortable in good society. That's how he felt he had been impacted. He is the classic white supremacist that you see today. They say that all of these people have taken away their right to feel comfortable, to exhibit their free speech, not to own slaves, but to be able to speak about it. It's the same excuse you find being used by that same community today. But we have it not just in America, it exists in Australia, it exists in Brazil, it exists in the UK. So that you find people saying, I'm not necessarily just against them all. I just want my free speech. I want to be able to say homosexuals go to hell. I want to be able to say that and not feel uncomfortable in good society because it's my religious liberty. That's how deceptive the arguments of the South become. The Christian right are able to use the Constitution and the Bible to their advantage if we accept their interpretation of it. Is what, again, the issue is interpretation. When we come down to our history, we find 2019. I hope everyone is following the news to see what is currently happening in the United States. For some years now, before the election of Donald Trump, we knew that this next president was going to be. We knew what this next president was going to be. From 2018, we knew what he was going to do this year. The dictatorship, the attacks on the media, all of this has not come as a surprise. We're in the middle of seeing a fulfillment of all our expectations. And this slavery history, was the North partly right and the South partly right? Did the South have a point? What's their point? They have slavery. But did the Millerites say the South has a point? We should listen to some of what they have to say about this issue? No. It was right and it was wrong. Truth and error. People that are falling in our Sunday law history are falling over what issue? They want to say Yeah, but the conservatives have a point. Jerry Falwell has a point. There must be a mixture of truth and error in slavery time and a mixture of truth and error in our time for that to make sense. They are afraid to take a hard position. Ellen G. White said that you cannot take the side of slavery. You cannot take the position of that evangelical Christian right and maintain the truths of this movement. One must surrender. They cannot exist in the same heart, and when they cannot exist in the same heart, you find that the people tested by the message of this dispensation give up one or they give up the other. 2014 was a turning point. We have recognized, I think this is the last paragraph. We have recognized that for some time, even externally, people recognize this. Those Christian voices impacting Washington in 2014, I want to quote one of them. She says the separation of church and state is a liberal leftist plan to ruin America and will be the death knell for our nation. You understand how they take the position of church and state. In the Millwright history, the key external issue they all identify was one of equality. Both sides used the same books, but had different interpretations. Both sides said all men are created equal, but they argued about what the word all meant. They had different methods of interpretation. Okay. I didn't remember that that was in here, but good, because that's the whole point. They had different methods of interpretation. When we come down to today, in this history of ours, we find that there are two sides with much of the same prejudices that has continued from 1798 through to our own time, where you find one side, the evangelical right, particularly still prevalent in the South, standing with Donald Trump and this Christian agenda of inequality. They are going to use the Constitution and the Bible. What you have are many Adventists, even many people who have been in this movement for a long time, seeing their arguments and saying, yeah, they have a point. If you couldn't do that in the history of slavery, you cannot do it now in ours. Then you have the other side, this movement, but it's not just this movement now. There are stones crying out. There are churches in America, white churches and black churches, saying we reject this coming together of church and state. We see the combination of church and state and we reject it. And you see them, I'll just say the North, but it's not just the North, it's a little more fluid now. And they're saying we reject the church and state. It's not our understanding of the Constitution and the Word of God. Both sides are not a mixture of truth and error. We either stand on one or the other. Ellen G. White says we cannot hold the principles of both in the same heart. Because of that, you see why this message that has begun from 2014 and continued to grow into the midnight cry of 2018 has caused division and heartache for many people, because they find that their old ideas that have defended or seen the world in much the same light, they have defended or seen the world in much the same light as this evangelical right movement led by Jerry Falwell, cannot exist in the same heart as the teachings of this movement. A division must occur. One must be surrendered. Ellen G. White says in regards to this history, the history of slavery, there is no such thing as a neutral position. Okay, that's it. I'm sorry I yelled at you guys constantly. I was so loud. I'm sorry. Susan, yes, they're allowed to say what they believe, but they're stigmatized because what they say is horrible racist things that no one wants to hear them say because everyone's so sick of it. So anyways, you guys can unmute and talk if you want to say anything. My head hurts.
Thank you for presenting.
Huh?
Thank you for presenting.
Yeah. So I think it's Tony Friday night, and then I'm on again next Wednesday, but we'll see, because this trying to make it home in time is like, is a little rough. But we'll see what happens. Okay. I hope that helped. If anything, that video, what was it called again? And I left it behind. What is the great test? I think that's what it was called. check that out, because that is the biggest issue. And I can safely say that my entire life I teeter-tottered back and forth in and out of church, and in and out of studying the Bible and getting close to God, because I like complete torture of wondering, am I even doing what's right? I feel guilty about everything that I'm doing. I don't understand. Like, this is so difficult. I don't even know if God cares about me. Like, how am I even supposed to know? Because all the Bible and White says is you have to be perfect and perfect and perfect. And God says you have to be perfect. And I don't know how in the world I'm ever going to be perfect. And and I got to a point where I got so depressed that I would just give up and fall off. And that's been my walk this entire time. And for the first time in my life, it makes sense. And I finally understand. And that video helped so much. And I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be here. I'm going to stay here as long as I possibly can. And prayerfully to the very end, because now everything is starting to make sense and come together, and it was worth all the roller coaster mess of my entire life to make it to this point. It was worth every minute, and I do it all over again. So the video, John, is, let me put it in the, where is it? There's a video, where are you? What is the great test? I'll just put it in the comments. There you go. So anyways, I'm pretty happy. And whatever comes up next, even if it hurts a lot and I don't like it, I don't care. I'm gonna stick around, because now this is the only thing on this planet that makes any sense to me. Nothing else makes any sense. This is the only thing that I even feel like I understand the planet that I live on. Yeah, Susan, everything. I always wondered, why is it in the New Testament, it seems like it just seemed like Paul and the apostles were saying that to be accepted by God is so easy, and I never understood how they could say that and be so happy about it when it's so hard to know if God accepts you or not. It hurt my brain to try to. I had such huge difficulties. Hold on. I had such huge difficulties because where is it? I didn't understand God's love, I didn't understand how he loved us. And there's times where I looked at how unfair a lot of women were in there, and I would think what Paul said, that women are to keep their mouths shut, and they're supposed to ask of their husbands, and they're supposed to be the head and all this. And then, I would be like, but why can't God see how messed up this turned into? And now it's all making sense. This isn't what he wanted. This is never what he wanted. His intentions are the most beautiful thing. If we're willing to just let him guide, he would lead us to the most beautiful, incredible things we could ever even imagine. So anyways, I think that's good enough for one night. Enough yelling at you guys. Let's go ahead and pray and let everyone go to sleep. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you so much for giving me the energy and ability to get through that, and for giving me the words and presence of mind. Thank you for always being with us in our Bible studies and always guiding them and making them a huge blessing for every single individual, Lord. You really love us and take care of us, and you've had so much mercy on us, even though we had wrong ideas. Lord, look what you brought us to. You knew the love we would have for the truth if we got to this point, and we would see how amazing it is. And you helped us hang on this whole time. So I ask that you continue to help us do this, Lord. Thank you for the beautiful meetings that have been coming out, that have been clearing things up more and more and helping us get through this time. Help us to be persevering in our studies and attempts to understand how to use correct methodology. Help us to understand the lines and how they work, Lord, because we have to know how to apply things correctly so we don't end up on the wrong side, like the other people using the biblical arguments also. Help us to push through, help us to fight, and to not give up. Help us to draw closer to you in the correct ways. Help our minds, Lord. If we still have preconceived notions, help those be put out and help us to understand when we are and what our job is. Help us to understand that great test. And thank you, Lord, so much for this incredible blessing and honor and privilege to be here at this time, at the end of the world. We thank you when we pray this in the Lord Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Okay.
That was a wonderful study. So thank you, Adriana, for all your hard work. And happy Thanksgiving to all of you. And rest well and see you Friday evening.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Tofurkey Day. Yeah, American Thanksgiving. Oh yeah, I was just thinking about that today because that's an American thing where we momentarily pretended like pilgrims and Indians were really best friends or something.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night,
All
guys.
right, good night.
That's
Oh,
God bless.
God bless.